Well, good morning and happy Easter, everybody. I hope that you are filled with the knowledge and memory of the Savior's love for you today. I hope that that's something that you take with you not just this week, but for a long time, that you think about the wonders of God's love shown for us on the cross and through the whole story of Easter. If you're like me, you've been pondering God's plan of redemption in the form of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection for several days now. You may have been meditating on all the details of it, the way it worked out, and thought about the wisdom of it. One thing that I do that you may not have been doing is thinking about what it would have been like if it had been me writing the story and coming up with a plan of redemption. And I have to say, be grateful it wasn't me. In thinking about what I would have done differently, I proved Paul right when he said in 1 Corinthians 1:25 that the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom. I fully acknowledge what God revealed about himself in Isaiah 55:8 and 9, that God's ways and his thoughts are infinitely greater and higher than mine. So take these next few thoughts on what I would have done and praise God for what he actually did. From my perspective, if I were writing the story and constructing the plan, if it were up to me, and really if it was up to any of us, it probably would have been a lot different. I've read enough books and I've seen enough movies to know that the hero is supposed to be this larger-than-life figure who's incredibly strong and able to forcibly impose his or her will against the powers of evil for the good of others. Emphasis on force, because that's how you win the fight. You fight, you dominate, and you make it happen. That's just how it happens. That's real-world winning. Our real-world winning. Survival of the fittest. You play king of the hill. You fight your way to the top, and then you fight to keep your rightful place on top. So imagine it from Israel's perspective. They were trying to reclaim their role in the world, as it was with David, where they were a real force to be reckoned with. Back to their old days, when they used to be great, when they used to matter. They had been a punching bag for the rest of the world for too long. They believed the Messiah would come and help them be great once again. They had been bullied for a long time, and they wanted to be the bully. That's what they were looking for in a Messiah, a tough king who wasn't going to take anything from anyone. Part of the reason it was so hard for the Jews to accept Jesus was that he wasn't what they were expecting. He just didn't look like the king who would rise up and make things right. They wanted to fight for their land and for their legacy. And the only way they saw victory coming was being led by a warrior or some tough guy that commanded respect, and it wouldn't be some average Joe leading a crew of nobodies. Winning to them meant defeating the Romans. It didn't mean getting beaten and then crucified by them. They wanted rebellion. That's how you get your freedom. You fight for it, right? What good could possibly come from a rebellion being led by a shepherd wannabe? How could freedom from oppression come from some teacher going around and telling people to turn the other cheek? Love your enemies. That's just not the way it's done. Not in our real world. And then think of it from the point of view of the disciples. This was not just their close friend and mentor that was getting turned over to the enemies. First, who would have thought their enemies would be their religious leaders? These were the guys that they listened to in synagogue growing up that were now taking their teacher away, their friend away, their brother. And they beat him and then handed him over to the Romans. What a bunch of traitors these people were. But now, because of all of this that was going on, they were in fear for their lives. Jesus' fate was going to be theirs. Isn't that what Jesus said? Matthew 24, verse 9 says that they would be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and that they would be hated by all nations because of him. The supposed leader of the new kingdom, betrayed by one of his own people, lied about in an illegal trial, beaten beyond all recognition, almost to the point of death, spit on, mocked, stripped naked, and then hung in shame on a cross to die painfully for the whole world to see. That's just not how victory comes, unless you are the people on the other side of it. This is not what winning looks like. Not from our reality, not from our view. Winners actually win. If you are on the side of right, you come out on top. And surely God wouldn't have let his son die like that. Surely if God was on the side of this Messiah, he wouldn't have been beaten like that. What good could possibly come from this situation? Of course, now we have the ability to look back at Scripture and see what good actually comes from this moment. But put yourself in these people's shoes. All they could see was what was unfolding in front of them. in real time. All they had to go on was their understanding of the way the world works and a warped understanding of what God should be doing so that they could be happy. But they were working with an incomplete picture, though. Everything was working against them in this moment, and it probably seemed like God was absent or didn't care what was going on. Maybe this Jesus guy didn't have God's stamp of approval after all. It seemed more than anything that Satan was in control of this moment. Maybe to a degree Satan was. Maybe this was Satan's doing, and God was only allowing it to happen. I don't know. But what you see from the story of the Bible is that God was constantly turning bad situations into something good. Take a look at the story of Joseph in Genesis. He was a somewhat spoiled teenager who had some very jealous older brothers who sold him into slavery. Human traffickers of the day, I guess. His brothers faked his death so they could explain to their dad why his favorite son wasn't there anymore. Joseph entered into a phase of his life where he would have to climb his way out of a pit several times. He tried making the best of his situation only to get thrown back into the pit time and time again. But he finally found himself becoming one of the leaders of Egypt, who was the world power of the day. He, with God's help, helped Egypt prepare for a famine that was going to hit the world, and they found themselves the country that all other countries would run to for help. Eventually, Joseph's family would be affected by the famine and were going without food. They had to go to Egypt to find help. What they found there, though, was this brother that had been sold into slavery was the very person they had to go to ask for help. Now, Joseph, he had every right to make them pay for what they had done, an eye for an eye and all that. His brothers had a reason to be afraid, and they were. But what Joseph did was he saw all that he had gone through as putting him in a position where he could help his family. And look what Joseph tells his brothers in Genesis 50, verse 20. Even though you planned evil against me, God planned good to come out of it. This was to keep many people alive, as he is doing now. What we can learn from this is that evil happens. Bad things happen in the lives of people. It can be because God caused something bad to happen, but usually it's just a result of living in a broken world. Either we do something dumb or someone else does something dumb, and we suffer the consequences of it. Sometimes bad things just happen because the world is broken, and sometimes Satan is right there in the middle of it. Whatever the cause is, whatever the intention was, whatever bad things happens, this is true. God has a plan for it. It might not be what God wanted to happen at first, but it's something that he can use to make things better in a big way. Romans 8:28 is a favorite verse for many. It says, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Paul doesn't say here that all things are good. He's talking about every moment in our lives, good and bad. God can take all these things and pull them together and turn them into something very good. What a powerful thought and truth. I think we have a tendency to stop halfway through when reading that verse, but we shouldn't, because the whole thing is very important. Paul says that God can turn the events of our lives, good or bad, into something really good for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. A couple things to remember when reading this. For this good to come about, you have to love God, and you also have to align yourself with his purposes. Think about Joseph again. He had to go through some really bad stuff for God to use him and help out a lot of people. God may not have wanted those things to happen to Joseph, and they may not have been in God's original plan for Joseph, but God sure was able to take that situation and turn it into something good. The deal for Joseph was he had to love God, which you saw was consistent throughout his life. And he had to use his situation to help others, which was aligning himself with God's purposes. God's purpose, his ultimate purpose for all people, is to show them love. And we were created to show that love to the world around us. That has been his plan from the beginning for all of us. Each one, depending on the gifts we were given, in our individual design, and in whatever situation we were placed in, we are to show God's love by taking care of his creation. That has been missing from our story since the fall, and it's something that we have lost sight of. And it's something that God has been working to restore to us ever since. In the story of the cross, few, if any, could see beyond what was happening right then. All they could see was darkness. God knew that all this was going to happen. Whether or not everything was all God's doing, God had a plan for every bit of it. You know, I'm sure Satan had a plan for it as well. I'm sure Satan's goal was not the redemption of mankind. I'm sure he saw this moment in time as a way to hurt Jesus by making one of Jesus' closest friends betray him. I'm sure Satan saw his influence over the leaders at that time as a way to cause more pain and bring about the death of someone who had waged war on his kingdom. I'm sure that Satan thought that with Jesus out of the picture, those weak picks for disciples Jesus had, they would just give up. There was nothing special about them, and they would return to being nothings and nobodies with him gone. I'm sure that Satan was also seeing this as a chance to attack the very heart of God, to cause God as much pain as possible. Satan saw nothing good coming from this moment, and that was just fine with him. And I'm sure that it did hurt God to the very core of his heart, but God had different plans for all of it. God was looking at a very different and bigger picture, and Jesus had to go through all of it for that picture and plan to unfold. We see that picture and that story unfolding into one that brings new life to all. Redemption, and that salvation, the salvation of all people is made possible through what Jesus went through. And the story, it didn't end at the cross. It kept going, and we see that in the resurrection. It didn't even end there, though, because after returning from the grave to be with his friends once again, we see that Jesus went back home to be with the Father. And there we see Jesus standing on our behalf, acting as an advocate for you and I. So this story, it just keeps going, and it keeps on getting bigger and better. In our lives, we see things happen. We experience bad things. We just have to be able to look beyond what we see, or at least realize that God can take this life we are living right now, these experiences, and turn them into something wonderful if we love him and align ourselves with God's plan for the world. God can use our lives, this moment in our lives, like he did with Joseph, to make the world a better place. It may not have the widespread effect Joseph had, but it can make a huge difference in the lives of others we encounter in this life. May God make us all worthy of his love. May he find our hearts longing after the things that he does. And may we make our lives and our experiences useful in spreading his love.